The person who keeps returning to a relationship that leaves them depleted, anxious, and questioning their worth will often explain it by saying they've met their twin flame. The intensity feels meaningful, the pain feels like growth. The inability to walk away gets reframed as evidence of a soul-level connection that transcends ordinary relationship dynamics. But intensity isn't the same as depth, and pain isn't the same as transformation. What gets called a twin flame connection is often a karmic relationship, a bond that activates unresolved wounds, triggers compulsive patterns, and creates the illusion of spiritual significance while actually just repeating familiar dysfunction with someone new. The difference between these two concepts matters because one framework encourages staying in patterns that cause harm, while the other acknowledges that some connections, no matter how magnetic, serve their purpose by ending. Understanding which you're in requires distinguishing between the discomfort that comes from genuine growth and the suffering that comes from trying to force resolution with someone who can't provide it. The language around karmic relationships and twin flames comes from spiritual frameworks, not clinical psychology, which means the terms carry assumptions that need examination. A karmic relationship, in spiritual discourse, describes a connection meant to teach lessons or resolve patterns from past lives. The intensity and difficulty are positioned as necessary for spiritual evolution. A twin flame describes two halves of the same soul meeting in physical form, destined to help each other reach their highest potential through profound mirroring and challenge. Both frameworks romanticize suffering and intensity as evidence of significance. Both suggest that difficulty in the relationship is a feature, not a bug, proof that important work is happening. But from a psychological perspective, these frameworks can justify staying in dynamics that would otherwise be recognized as toxic, codependent, or simply incompatible. The spiritual language obscures what's actually happening. Two people are triggering each other's attachment wounds, unresolved trauma, and defensive patterns in ways that feel compelling but aren't producing the growth or healing the language promises. Karmic relationships typically display specific, recognizable patterns. They begin with intense, immediate attraction that feels fated or predestined. There's a sense of knowing the person already, of recognition that bypasses ordinary getting-to-know-you processes. The connection moves fast, emotionally, physically, sometimes in terms of commitment or enmeshment. But alongside the intensity comes volatility. The highs are euphoric, the lows are devastating. There's constant drama, breakups and reconciliations, passionate arguments followed by passionate reconnection, a cycle that exhausts everyone involved but feels impossible to stop. Communication is poor despite the claimed depth of connection. Boundaries are non-existent or constantly violated. One or both people become obsessive, unable to think about anything else, organizing their entire life around the relationship and the other person's availability or mood. Codependency develops quickly. Self-worth becomes dependent on the other person's validation. There's lying, hiding, manipulation, not necessarily malicious, but driven by fear of losing the connection or triggering the other person's reactivity. And underneath all of it sits the persistent sense that if you just try harder, heal more, become better, the relationship will finally stabilize into what it's supposed to be. What's actually happening in most karmic relationships is mutual activation of attachment wounds. Someone with anxious attachment meets someone with avoidant attachment, and they trigger each other perfectly. The anxious person's fear of abandonment meets the avoidant person's fear of engulfment. The anxious person pursues, the avoidant person withdraws. The anxiety intensifies, the avoidance intensifies, and the cycle accelerates until something breaks. Or two people with disorganized attachment, where intimacy triggers both the desire for closeness and terror of it simultaneously, create a chaotic push-pull dynamic where neither person knows what they want moment to moment. The intensity isn't evidence of a special connection. It's evidence of activated nervous systems responding to perceived threat. The compulsion to stay isn't destiny. It's trauma bonding, the biochemical addiction that forms when intermittent reinforcement and high stress create powerful neurochemical bonds similar to those seen in abuse dynamics. And the sense that this person uniquely understands you often reflects projection and idealization rather than actual attunement. They're not seeing who you really are. They're reflecting back the unmet needs and unresolved wounds you're unconsciously trying to resolve through them. Twin flame relationships, as described in spiritual literature, share some similarities but supposedly differ in function and outcome. Both involve intensity and mutual triggering. Both activate deep wounds and unresolved material. But the twin flame concept suggests this activation serves conscious growth rather than unconscious repetition. The relationship acts as a mirror that shows each person their shadow material, their defenses, their places of woundedness, and both people commit to using that information for transformation rather than just reacting from it. The conflict isn't endless cycling. It's confrontation followed by integration. The challenge isn't about winning or controlling the other person, it's about facing what the interaction reveals about yourself. And critically, the twin flame framework includes separation as potentially necessary. If the work of the relationship requires space, both people can trust that separation serves growth rather than indicating failure. The relationship might not be forever, but the transformation is. The problem with the twin flame concept is that it can justify the same toxic dynamics as karmic relationships while adding a layer of spiritual significance that makes them harder to leave. If you believe someone is your twin flame, their hurtful behavior becomes reframed as necessary mirroring. Their unavailability becomes the runner-chaser dynamic you're supposed to navigate. Their refusal to do their own healing work becomes your opportunity to embody unconditional love. The concept can trap people in relationships where they're doing all the work of growth while their partner continues damaging patterns, and the person stays because leaving would mean it wasn't the cosmic connection they believed in. From a psychological perspective, a genuinely growth-producing relationship, whether you call it twin flame or not, requires both people actively engaged in self-examination and change. It requires safe enough attachment that vulnerability is possible without constant threat of abandonment or retaliation. It requires repair after rupture, not just repeated rupture with no resolution. And it requires that the relationship actually improves over time as both people integrate what they're learning, rather than just cycling through the same conflicts with increasing intensity. The distinction that actually matters isn't between karmic and twin flame. It's between relationships that, despite their difficulty, support genuine development and relationships that just reinforce existing patterns while causing harm. A difficult relationship that's genuinely developmental shows certain features. Both people take responsibility for their part in conflicts, rather than just blaming the other. There's movement over time. Patterns get recognized, discussed, and gradually shift, rather than just repeating endlessly. Repair happens. When someone hurts the other, there's genuine apology, behavior change, and rebuilding of trust, rather than just moving past it until the next eruption. Both people have lives, identities, and sources of meaning outside the relationship, rather than being entirely consumed by it. And critically, both people feel like they're becoming more themselves, more integrated, more integratable, more able to access their full range of humanity, rather than feeling like they're losing themselves, fragmenting, or becoming someone unrecognizable. If a relationship, no matter how intense or meaningful it feels, is making you smaller, more anxious, more dependent, more cut off from other relationships and activities that matter, that's not growth. That's deterioration dressed up in spiritual language. Working with the pull of these intense connections requires distinguishing intuition and compulsion. Intuition about a relationship feels calm even when it's delivering uncomfortable information. It doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't create panic. Compulsion feels urgent, desperate, consuming. It hijacks attention. It creates narratives about what will happen if you don't act, catastrophic scenarios that bypass rational thought. When someone feels they must contact their twin flame, must fix the relationship, must prove their devotion despite all evidence that the dynamic is harmful, That's compulsion driven by attachment wounds, not intuitive knowing. The practice involves noticing when urgency arises and pausing instead of acting. What does the urgency feel like in the body? Where does it locate? What does it remind you of? What earlier experiences of threat or loss? Just noticing creates enough space that the compulsion doesn't automatically translate into action. From that space, actual choice becomes possible. The choice might still be to engage with the person, but it's a choice informed by awareness of what's driving it rather than an unconscious reaction to activated attachment fear. Another dimension involves examining what you're actually getting from the relationship versus what you're hoping to get. Often in karmic or twin flame relationships, the person stays because of potential. What the relationship could be if certain conditions were met, if both people healed enough, if timing improved, if external circumstances changed. But potential isn't reality. The question isn't what this relationship might become someday. The question is what it actually is right now, today, in its current form. Does this relationship, as it exists, support your well-being and development? Do you feel more secure, more capable, more connected to yourself and others when you're in it? Or do you feel anxious, depleted, uncertain of your worth, cut off from other meaningful connections? The answers to those questions about present reality matter more than stories about destiny or lessons or what might be possible in some imagined future. If the relationship isn't serving you now, staying for potential means sacrificing present well-being for a future that may never arrive. A third practice is checking the relationship against markers of secure attachment rather than against spiritual frameworks. Secure attachment, which correlates with long-term relationship satisfaction and individual well-being, involves specific observable features. Both people can express needs and have those needs met reliably more often than not. Conflict happens but gets repaired through communication and behavior change. There's trust that the other person won't abandon you for having needs or making mistakes. There's space for both togetherness and autonomy without either threatening the relationship. You can be yourself, messy, imperfect, having a bad day, without fear that it will cost you the connection. The relationship enhances your life rather than consuming it. You maintain friendships, interests, personal growth outside the partnership. When you imagine life without this person, it's sad but survivable rather than catastrophic. These markers describe what securely attached relationships provide. If your karmic or twin flame relationship doesn't include these features, if it's all intensity and activation with no foundation of safety and reliability, then regardless of how meaningful the spiritual narrative feels, the relationship isn't meeting basic psychological needs that predict well-being. The fourth approach involves working with whatever the relationship is revealing about your own patterns without depending on the other person to change. This is where the spiritual language gets something right. These intense connections do surface unresolved material. The error is assuming resolution requires the other person's participation. If the relationship reveals that you lose yourself trying to keep others happy, that pattern exists whether or not this person stays. If it shows that you're terrified of abandonment and will tolerate harmful behavior to avoid it, that terror predates this relationship and will persist into future ones unless addressed. If it demonstrates that you're drawn to unavailable people who can't meet your needs, that attraction points to internal working models about relationships formed in childhood. The work isn't convincing your twin flame to become available. The work is understanding why unavailability feels compelling. What childhood adaptation made that seem like the safest option, and gradually building capacity to choose differently. That work happens in therapy, through sustained self-examination, in deliberately choosing relationships that feel less intense but more secure. The karmic or twin flame relationship can be the catalyst that shows you what needs attention, but it's not the container where healing happens. The fifth method requires honest assessment of whether the other person is actually doing their work, or if you're carrying the entire growth process while they remain unchanged. Twin flame literature often describes runner-chaser dynamics, where one person flees intimacy while the other pursues, and both are supposedly learning necessary lessons. But if you've been the chaser for months or years, doing therapy, reading books, examining your patterns, trying new approaches, while the other person continues the exact same avoidant or hurtful behaviors with no evidence of self-examination or change, that's not a mutual growth process. That's you doing all the work while they benefit from your effort without reciprocating. Genuine developmental relationships require both people engaged in the process. If only one person is growing and changing, that's not a twin flame dynamic, or even a healthy karmic relationship. That's one person using spiritual language to justify staying with someone who isn't meeting them in the work. Recognizing this doesn't mean the other person is bad or wrong. It means they're not in a place where mutual growth is possible, and staying doesn't serve either person's actual development regardless of how the spiritual narrative frames it. The sixth practice involves creating and maintaining boundaries, even within the intense connection. Spiritual frameworks sometimes suggest that true twin flames operate without boundaries because they're essentially one soul. But boundaries aren't walls that separate. They're the structures that make genuine intimacy possible. Without boundaries, there's enmeshment, a loss of self, where you can't tell where you end and the other person begins. With boundaries, both people remain distinct individuals choosing connection rather than losing themselves in fusion. Practicing boundaries in a karmic or twin flame relationship means maintaining your own life, interests, and relationships outside the partnership. It means not tolerating behavior that harms you just because the connection feels significant. It means being willing to take space when the interaction becomes damaging, rather than staying in constant contact because separation feels unbearable. If the other person interprets boundaries as rejection or punishment, that reaction reveals their own wounds and doesn't invalidate the necessity of the boundaries. A relationship that can't survive healthy boundaries isn't healthy, regardless of how spiritually significant it claims to be. Integration means accepting that a relationship can be meaningful and growth-producing and still need to end. The spiritual frameworks around karmic relationships and twin flames often carry implicit assumptions that the connection, once recognized, should be maintained. That walking away means failing the lesson or refusing the growth. But sometimes the growth is in recognizing incompatibility despite attraction. Sometimes the lesson is learning that intensity isn't the same as compatibility, that someone can activate profound things in you without being someone you should build a life with. Sometimes the most important development is choosing to leave a dynamic that harms you, even though it feels significant, demonstrating to yourself that you can prioritize well-being over intensity. That's not spiritual failure, that's maturity. The person you were will always be changed by the connection, the wounds it activated, the patterns it revealed, the work it demanded. That transformation remains whether or not the relationship continues. And often, the relationship needs to end precisely so that the transformation can integrate. Staying in the intensity keeps you activated, reactive, unable to gain the perspective necessary to actually learn from what happened. Distance allows reflection. It allows the nervous system to regulate. It creates space to see what the relationship actually was rather than what the spiritual narrative claimed it should be. The person from the opening who keeps returning to an exhausting relationship while calling it a twin flame connection has options once the framework shifts. They can examine whether the relationship, in its current reality rather than its imagined potential, actually supports growth or just triggers familiar patterns. They can notice when compulsion drives contact and pause long enough to question what's actually happening versus what fear or longing is claiming. They can start doing the work the relationship revealed, addressing their own attachment wounds, building capacity for secure connection, learning to recognize healthy relating, without depending on this person's participation or validation. They can establish and maintain boundaries even if the other person resists them, recognizing that a relationship that requires the abandonment of boundaries isn't sustainable or healthy. They can honestly assess whether both people are engaged in growth or if they're carrying the entire process alone. And they can consider that the most profound growth might come not from staying and suffering more, but from recognizing that this particular connection, however intense, has served its purpose, and that continuing it causes more harm than remaining offers benefit. The spiritual language about karma and twin flames can obscure these choices by framing leaving as failure. But leaving a relationship that depletes you isn't failure, it's clarity. And clarity about what actually serves your development versus what just feels familiar or intense is exactly the growth these difficult connections are meant to produce, though perhaps not in the way the spiritual frameworks imagine.